The snow had already buried her boots when Eli Sullivan found her, and if he had taken one trail instead of another that bitter December evening in 1879, Eliza Dawson would have simply been a body come spring thaw. He had been running his trap line along the eastern face of the Bitterroot Range in Montana Territory, the kind of work that kept a man's hands raw and his mind quiet, which was precisely why Eli Sullivan had chosen it. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, not a romanticized figure from some dime novel, but a man of 31 who had spent the better part of a decade learning the language of these mountains. The way the wind shifted before a storm, the way elk moved when a predator had passed through, the way snow could lie soft as cotton in one hollow and hard as iron in the next. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with a jaw that looked as if it had been cut from the same granite that made up these peaks, and eyes of a gray-green that held a steadiness most men in civilization never quite managed to find. He did not talk much. He had never found much reason to. It was the color that stopped him first. A wash of dark red wool against the white, roughly 3 miles short of Henderson Pass, the only route over the mountains for 100 miles in either direction that a wagon or a horse could navigate in summer months. In December, even that pass was treacherous, and the narrow game trail he was following was nothing short of suicidal for anyone who did not know exactly where to put their feet. He pulled up short, the snowshoes he was wearing whispering to a stop, and he stared at the shape for a long moment before his brain assembled what his eyes were seeing. A woman. Sitting against the base of a lodgepole pine, her knees drawn up to her chest, her head fallen sideways so that her cheek rested on her own shoulder. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and lay across her face in ribbons, and the red wool coat she wore, fine quality, not made for the mountains, was crusted along the shoulders and across the lap with a good 2 inches of fresh powder. She was not moving. She was not shivering. That was the worst sign of all. When a body stopped shivering, it had given up the fight. Eli crossed to her in 3 long strides, dropped to one knee in the snow, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. The pulse was there, faint, slow, but present, like a watch winding down rather than stopped. He breathed out once, a long, controlled exhale that put steam in the air between them. "All right," he said quietly, to no one, to her, to the mountains. "All right." He did not know her, had never seen her face before, though even in this state, with her lips going pale and her skin the color of birch bark in winter, he could see that it was a face worth knowing. He pushed that thought aside with a practiced efficiency, because there was work to do before there was anything else. He checked her hands first, pulling off the gloves, good leather but thin, not thick enough for this cold, and examining each finger. Some white at the tips, which meant frostbite was beginning, but nothing blackened, nothing lost yet. He pressed the backs of her hands between his own palms and breathed on them, watching. Her fingers twitched. Small mercy. He looked around and quickly assessed the situation with the calm practicality that years in these mountains had built into him. The sky was the color of a bruise above the tree line, and the light was going fast. There were maybe 40 minutes before full dark, and the temperature would drop another 15 degrees with the sun. His cabin was roughly 4 miles southeast, downhill most of the way, but not easy country even in good light. He did not weigh the decision very long, because there was truly only one decision to make. He unwound the heavy wool blanket he kept rolled and strapped across his pack, shook the snow from it, and wrapped it around her before he lifted her. She was not a small woman, not tall, but solidly built, with the kind of sturdy frame that spoke of a life that involved actual labor. He estimated her at perhaps 25 or 26 years of age, though he would learn later he was off by a year. She was 24. She made a small sound when he lifted her, something that was not quite a word but was not nothing either, and he adjusted his grip, settling her against his chest with her head against his shoulder, and he began to walk. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was not conscious enough to hear it, and the mountain did not care for conversation. He walked with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who understood that haste in this terrain was how people died, placing each snowshoed foot with precision, reading the slope by instinct and long familiarity. She was heavy against him, but he was a strong man and a stubborn one, and he had carried heavier loads over worse ground. He thought about the fire he would need to build, the broth he would need to heat, the way you had to warm a person slowly, not fast, when hypothermia had gotten its claws in. He had seen men rush the warming and lose them anyway. He would not rush. She stirred twice during that long walk. The first time she said something that might have been a name, her lips barely moving, and then went still again. The second time she tried to lift her head and could not manage it, and simply turned her face more firmly into the front of his coat, as if she had made a decision about it. He shifted his arms to better support the weight of her head and kept walking. The cabin came into view through the dark trees with the particular relief that a man alone in the mountains feels when he sees shelter, a deep, bone-level gratitude that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival. It was not much to look at. A single-room structure of hewn logs, well chinked against the wind, with a low porch and a stone chimney, and a woodpile stacked under a lean-to on the south wall that would have made any reasonable person feel better just looking at it. There was a barn of sorts behind it, just large enough for his 2 horses and some winter stores. It was a bachelor's place, clean but spare, with no particular softness to it. It was about to have a guest. He got the door open without putting her down, which required a degree of maneuvering, and brought her inside. The cabin was cold. He had let the fire die down when he went out that morning because he had planned to be back by early afternoon, but it was out of the wind, and that was something. He laid her on the rope bed in the corner, which had a cornhusk mattress and 2 heavy buffalo robes piled on it, and left her there long enough to get to the fireplace. The fire took hold quickly because he knew what he was doing, and within 10 minutes it had gone from nothing to a respectable heat pushing out into the room. He hung the iron pot of water over it, the pot he kept perpetually half-filled from the barrel he kept inside in winter, and then he turned back to her. He removed her boots first, checking her feet the same careful way he had checked her hands, better there than he had feared. He covered her feet with a piece of flannel and left them. He debated the propriety of removing her coat and then set propriety aside because propriety was a luxury and frostbite was a reality, and removed the coat carefully, checking her arms for any signs of deeper cold injury. Her hands were worse than her feet, but he had caught it in time. He thought he had caught it in time. He wrapped her in the buffalo robe all the way up to her chin, and he put another log on the fire, and then he made the broth. It was a simple broth, dried venison and wild onion and a bit of salt, because simple was what he had, and he heated it carefully and brought it to her in a tin cup. She was more awake by then. Her eyes were open, though unfocused, moving around the ceiling of the cabin with the slow, confused survey of someone who does not know where they are and does not yet have the resources to care. He sat on the edge of the bed and he said nothing. He simply held the cup near her face so she could feel the steam, and waited. Her eyes found the steam first, and then they found his face, and for a moment she looked at him with the pure, uncomplicated terror of a person who has woken in a strange place with a strange man, and he understood that terror and did not take offense at it. "You are safe," he said. It was the first thing he said to her, and he said it quietly and steadily, the way you spoke to a frightened animal. "You are in a cabin. You were in the snow. I brought you here. You are safe." She stared at him for a long moment, and something in his face or his voice must have convinced her, because the terror slowly receded, replaced by something more like exhaustion. She did not speak. He held the cup out and she took it with both hands. He noted with relief that she had feeling in those hands. The way she gripped the cup was tentative but deliberate, and she drank. He said nothing more until she was warm. That was a promise he made to himself in that first moment, watching her drink the broth in small, careful sips. He would not pepper her with questions, would not demand the explanation that any reasonable person would want. He would let the fire do its work and the broth do its work and the warmth do its work, and when she was truly warm, then she could tell him whatever she chose to tell him. It took 3 hours. He fed the fire, heated more broth, and at some point made himself a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, which he ate sitting in the one chair by the fire with his back to her to give her what privacy the small space allowed. He could hear when her breathing changed, when the shallow, dangerous brevity of hypothermia gave way to the deeper, slower rhythm of genuine rest. He did not interrupt it. When he turned back around sometime near midnight, she was sitting up against the log wall, the buffalo robe still wrapped around her shoulders, watching him with dark eyes that were now fully present and fully intelligent. She had color in her face again. Not much, but enough. Her hands around the empty cup in her lap were no longer white at the tips. He met her gaze and waited. "My name is Eliza Dawson," she said. Her voice was rough from cold and disuse, but it was steady. There was a quality to it he noticed immediately, a directness, an absence of the particular trembling deference that some women adopted as a matter of social habit. She spoke like a person accustomed to being heard. "I imagine you have questions." "A few," he said. "Ask them, then." "How did you get 3 miles from the pass in a December snowstorm wearing those boots?" It was the most pressing of the practical questions, and she answered it practically. She had come over Henderson Pass from the Idaho side with a hired driver and a wagon carrying her belongings. The driver, a man named Corbus who worked out of Salmon City, had been, in her words, spectacularly unreliable, and had abandoned both wagon and passenger when the first serious snow began to fall, apparently deciding that his own skin was worth more than his professional obligations. She had tried to walk. She had known it was foolish. She had done it anyway because the alternative was to freeze in the wagon, and motion had seemed better than stillness. "Motion is better than stillness," Eli said. "Generally, you were right about that." "I was not right enough," she said. There was a dry self-awareness in it that he found himself unexpectedly liking. "Where were you headed?" "Harlow Creek," she said. "I have a letter of employment there, a schoolteacher position. I was supposed to arrive 2 weeks ago." She paused. "I had some difficulties in getting away." He did not ask about those difficulties. Not yet. He told her his name, Eli Sullivan, trapper and guide, resident of these mountains for the past 8 years, originally from Ohio, and she nodded as if filing it carefully. He told her she was welcome to stay until the weather broke and he could get her safely to Harlow Creek, which was a settlement about 12 miles east of his cabin and a place he knew reasonably well, having traded there through the years. "I accept," she said, without hesitation and without particular ceremony. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Eli," he said. "Eli," she repeated, and that was how it started. She slept the rest of that night and most of the following day, which he expected and encouraged by simply going about his business quietly and leaving her to it. He checked her hands in the morning and found them improved, though the tips of 2 fingers on her right hand were blistered, a sign of superficial frostbite that would heal without permanent damage if kept clean and left alone. He told her this when she woke in the late afternoon, and she examined her own fingers with a businesslike gravity that suggested she was not going to make a production of it. "They hurt," she said. "That is a good sign," he said. "Means the feeling is coming back." She thought about this. What a peculiar thing to be grateful for. "Most things you are grateful for out here are peculiar," he said. The storm continued for 3 more days. The world beyond the cabin windows was a white obliteration, wind driving the snow sideways, visibility reduced to a matter of feet. They were, quite simply, stuck with each other, and Eli Sullivan discovered over those 3 days something that he had not expected to discover, which was that being stuck with Eliza Dawson was not an unpleasant experience. It was, in fact, the least lonely he had felt in a very long time, which was a thought he held at arm's length and examined with considerable suspicion. She was curious. That was the first thing he noticed, not the politeness of someone making conversation to fill silence, but genuine and wide-ranging curiosity, the kind that alighted on a new subject the way a hawk alighted on a fence post, with decisive and total attention. She asked him about the mountains, not the romantic version, the painted picture book mountains of the newspapers, but the actual mountains, how they worked, what lived in them, what they would kill you with if you let them. He found himself answering more fully than he was accustomed to answering, because her questions were good questions, the kind that had followed thought. She had grown up in Cincinnati. Her father had been a schoolteacher himself, and her mother had died when Eliza was 11. She had two older brothers, both working the Ohio River trade. She had taught school in a small town in Ohio for 2 years, and then something had happened. She mentioned it obliquely on the second day, simply calling it a situation that made staying impossible, and she had applied for the posting in Harlow Creek, which had been advertised in a Cincinnati newspaper by the Territory School Board as a position in a growing and promising community, which, as Eli could tell her, was generous language for a town of 300 people, a general store, a church, a saloon, and a significant number of strongly held opinions. "Have you been there often?" she asked. "Often enough," he said. "Nice enough people mostly. Scratching hard at a living like everyone out here." "Is there truly a school?" "There's a building that has been a school, a meeting hall, and a Baptist revival in the same year," he said. "But yes, children who need teaching." She seemed to find this satisfying rather than discouraging. He noticed that about her, she had a way of looking at a difficult thing and finding in it not a reason to turn back but a problem that invited solution. He thought it was possibly the most useful quality a person could have for the life she was proposing to live. On the second evening, when the fire had burned to a steady, comfortable heat, and the wind had softened temporarily to a moan rather than a howl, she asked him about himself. Not the biographical facts, she had those, but the harder question. Why was he here? Not here in the cabin, but here in the mountains, alone, in the way that a man was alone when he had chosen solitude as a deliberate arrangement rather than an accident. He was quiet for a while. She did not fill the silence with words which he appreciated. "I had a partner," he said finally. "Trapping. Man named Harlan West. Good man, better than most." He paused. "We were caught in an early storm about 4 years ago up in the North Range. He did not make it out. He said it plainly, the way you stated a fact about the weather or the price of beaver pelt. But she was watching him with those dark eyes, and he understood that she heard what was underneath the plainness. 'I am sorry,' she said, and then she said nothing more, which was exactly the right amount. 'After that I just stayed up here,' he said. 'Seemed easier.' Easier than what?" He thought about it honestly. "Then going back to places where things happened." She nodded slowly. "I understand that better than you might think," she said. He looked at her. The firelight was moving on her face, and her dark hair was still loose around her shoulders. She had lost most of her hairpins in the snow and managed only to secure it loosely with the 2 that remained, and there was an expression on her face that was careful and a little old, the expression of someone who carried something and had gotten good at carrying it. "The situation that made staying impossible," he said. "Yes," she said. He waited. "I was engaged," she said, "to a man named Gerald Pfeiffer. His family had money. My family did not. It seemed at the time like a reasonable arrangement." She straightened her back slightly, a small, unconscious gesture of dignity. "He was not a kind man. I did not know that well enough before I agreed. By the time I knew it thoroughly, his family had made it clear that leaving the engagement would be complicated." "Complicated how?" "My father still owed money to Gerald's father," she said. "I was told that leaving would result in that debt being called in immediately, and my father was old and not well and would not have managed it." She looked at the fire. "I stayed engaged for almost a year, and then my father died." Eli was quiet. "And then," she said, with a tone that was almost but not quite matter-of-fact, "there was no reason to stay, so I left. I left the town, the engagement, the state. I found the posting in Montana Territory, wrote a letter, received a letter back offering the position, and came west." She turned back to look at him. "Gerald did not take it gracefully, but he did not follow me past the Ohio border, which is what I asked God for every mile of the journey west." "Did you ask God for the driver who abandoned you in a mountain snowstorm?" Eli said. She blinked at him and then she laughed. It was an unexpected laugh, full and genuine, slightly surprised by itself, and it did something very particular to Eli Sullivan's chest that he chose not to examine immediately. "I did not ask for him specifically," she said. "I believe he came free of charge." On the fourth morning, the storm broke. The sky over the Bitterroots was the precise shade of blue that only appeared after a serious winter storm, a blue so clean and deep it looked almost artificial, and the snow lay over everything in unbroken white sheets that sparkled as if someone had ground diamonds into the surface. Eli went out at dawn to see to the horses and to assess the trail, and when he came back in, Eliza had gotten up and was standing at the small window with her arms wrapped around herself, looking out at it. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. He hung his coat and came to stand beside her at the window, not thinking about it, and they stood together for a moment looking at the mountain world in its winter perfection. He was close enough to smell the faint lavender of whatever she put in her hair, which struck him as a remarkable thing to notice, and he took a careful step back. "The trail to Harlow Creek will be manageable by tomorrow," he said. "I have 2 horses. We can go together." She turned to look at him. "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to," he said. "You would likely find your way well enough with a good horse and a clear day." He paused. "But I know the country and you do not, and there are places on that eastern trail where the snow bridges over the creek and looks solid and is not. I will take you." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. "Then I thank you. Again." They spent that last day in preparation. She went through her coat and the small bag she had managed to keep with her through the ordeal, taking stock of what she had. He found her an old pair of thick woolen stockings and a pair of riding gloves that had belonged to Harlan and had been folded in a trunk for 4 years, and he almost did not give them to her, and then did. She held the gloves in her hands. "These belong to someone," she said. It was not a question. "My partner," he said. "Harlan, they are better than what you have." She looked up at him. "I will take good care of them," she said, with a solemnity that told him she understood entirely. "Just keep your hands warm," he said. He made a better dinner than usual that evening. He had smoked venison and dried beans and the last of a jar of preserved peaches a trader had given him in October, which was the closest thing to luxury available in that cabin in December. She set the small table with a natural ease, finding his 2 plates and his 2 cups without being told where they were, as if she had simply looked at the cabin and understood its logic. They ate together in the firelight and the conversation moved easily. She told him about Cincinnati, about the river in summer, about a school teacher she had loved as a child who had read Dickens aloud to the class. He told her about Ohio, where he had grown up on a farm near Columbus, about his mother's cooking, about the moment he had decided at the age of 21 to go west, and what that decision had felt like from the inside. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "Not the way I expected to be," he said. "I was afraid I had made the wrong choice, not afraid of what was ahead." He considered. The fear of the unknown is smaller, usually, than the fear of staying in the wrong life. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is precisely it." They turned in early because the morning would be long. She took the bed naturally, and he made himself comfortable on the floor by the fire with his bedroll, which was not the first time he had slept on that floor and was entirely bearable. He lay on his back and listened to the settling of the cabin and the sound of her breathing evening out toward sleep, and he thought about nothing in particular for a while. And then he thought about the fact that the cabin was going to be very quiet after tomorrow, which was a thought he set aside firmly because it was not useful. She was asleep before him. He could tell by the change in her breathing. He looked at the ceiling and admitted, privately and without elaboration, that he had not felt this way about anyone in a considerable number of years. He did not do anything with this admission except acknowledge it and then deliberately go to sleep. They left at first light. The horses were fresh and willing. His big bay gelding named Carver, and the smaller, steadier roan he had owned for 5 years and called Rue, and Eliza mounted with the confidence of someone who had been around horses, if not in the mountains. She sat well, back straight, hands easy on the reins, and she did not make a production of the cold, which was formidable. He had given her a wool scarf, and she had wrapped it over the lower half of her face so that only those dark eyes were visible above it, which for some reason made her look both more anonymous and more herself. The trail to Harlow Creek took them through pine forest first, and then out onto a long exposed ridge where the wind came sideways, and the snow was both beautiful and merciless. He went in front on Carver, breaking the trail, and she followed on Rue with a steady reliability. He stopped several times to point out the places where the trail looked obvious, but was not the creek crossing that had snow over it 3 feet deep, but only 8 inches of ice below. And she listened without question or complaint, and did exactly what he said. Partway down the eastern slope, where the trail curved around a granite outcropping and gave a sudden view of the valley below with the thin, dark thread of Harlow Creek's main street visible in the distance, she pulled up beside him and they looked at it together. "There it is," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet. He could not see her expression behind the scarf, but he could hear something in it, the complexity of a person who has arrived at the thing they were traveling toward and is not yet sure how to feel about it. "Good town," he said. "They will be glad to have a teacher." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you come back this way often to trade?" He looked at her. She was looking at the valley. "I come in most weeks in winter," he said. "Supply runs." She nodded, still looking at the valley. "Good," she said, and clicked Rue forward. He followed and told himself it meant nothing, and the horse beneath him moved on through the snow, and the valley came up to meet them. Harlow Creek in December of 1879 was a place of determined existence rather than comfort. The main street was a muddy slash through the snow, frozen at this hour of the morning to a rutted iron hardness, lined with buildings that ranged from the ambitious to the merely pragmatic. The general store was Callaway's, run by a bearded man of prodigious size and unexpected gentleness named James Callaway, who sold everything from flour to dynamite, and who treated his customers with the same democratic goodwill regardless of their station. There was a saloon called the Copper Nail, which had a decent reputation as these things went, managed by a woman named Bess Ridout, who tolerated no serious trouble and served a serviceable whiskey. The church was a white-painted frame building with a crooked steeple that had been hit by lightning in '77 and never quite properly repaired. And there was the schoolhouse, the building Eliza had come all this way to find, a single-room structure on the north end of the street with a bell above the door and frost on the windows and a small stovepipe chimney that currently exhaled nothing. The man who met them was Henry Alcott, who served as Harlow Creek's informal mayor and school board in one. He was a lean man of 50 with a gray beard and sharp eyes, and the manner of someone who had learned to handle disruption calmly, because the frontier produced disruption in industrial quantities. He had been expecting Eliza Dawson for 2 weeks, and was too practical a man to waste more than a moment expressing relief at her arrival before moving on to the logistics of it. He shook Eli's hand. The two men knew each other by the mutual acquaintance of the frontier, that practical respect between people who had each managed to survive in a hard country. "Sullivan," Alcott said. "Henry. Found her up on the pass, 3 miles short of it." Alcott looked at Eliza with the kind of assessment that was not unkind but was entirely frank. "You look reasonably intact." "I am reasonably intact," she said. "I would like to see the schoolhouse if it is convenient." He walked her to it immediately. Eli followed at a slight distance, which put him in the position of watching her face when she opened the door of the schoolhouse and went inside. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the rows of rough benches, the slate board at the front, the cold pot-bellied stove in the corner, the stack of McGuffey readers on the teacher's desk, the single window with its frost lace. And then she walked in, went to the desk, ran her gloved fingers along the top of it, and turned to face the empty benches with an expression that was unmistakably satisfaction. "When can I start?" she asked Alcott. "Monday," he said, and that was essentially settled. He found her a boarding situation with a widow named Clara Marsh, who had a large house by local standards, 4 rooms, and who took in boarders for the income, and because she liked the company. Mrs. Marsh was a comfortable woman in her late 40s with a red face and a generous spirit, and she took one look at Eliza and immediately began talking about what she would feed her, which Eli thought was probably the perfect first response to the situation. He stayed in town that day to see her settled. He told himself it was practical. It was already late afternoon, and riding back in the dark was foolish. But the truth was more various than that, and he was self-aware enough to know it. He helped carry her trunk, which Alcott had sent someone to retrieve from the wagon she had abandoned on the pass road. He ate supper at the Copper Nail with James Calloway and 2 ranchers who were in for supplies, listening to the conversation about cattle prices and the territorial government, and whether the railroad was actually coming or whether that was another lie from the east. He drank 1 glass of whiskey, slowly, because he had never been much of a drinker. And in the morning, early, before he left, he knocked on Mrs. Marsh's door. It was Eliza who answered. She was already dressed, in a gray wool dress that he had not seen before, found presumably in her trunk, with her dark hair up properly now that she had retrieved her full complement of hairpins. She looked different from how she had looked in his cabin, more formal, more assembled, but her eyes were the same. "You are leaving," she said. "I am," he said, "needed to say goodbye and to make sure the fingers are healing." She held up her right hand, extending the 2 injured fingers. They were bandaged now with proper bandaging from Calloway's store. "Dr. Finch says they will be fine," she said. Dr. Finch was Harlow Creek's physician, who also served as the barber and the dentist by necessity. "Good," Eli said. There was a pause. "Thank you, Eli," she said. "I mean it in a way that is difficult to put in adequate language. You saved my life." "You were breathing when I found you," he said. "I would not have been breathing much longer," she said. He nodded, accepting that. "I will see you when you come to town," she said. And then, with a composure that he suspected had been deliberately assembled, "I hope that is soon." He held her gaze for a moment. "It will be," he said. He meant it, and they both knew he meant it, and he turned and went to Carver and rode back up into the mountains, and the whole ride back he was thinking about things he had not thought about in 4 years. He came back in 10 days. He had planned to wait 2 weeks, because 2 weeks was a reasonable interval for a supply run, and he was not going to be foolish about this. He lasted 10 days, came in on a clear cold morning with his pack horse loaded with pelts for the trading post and a list of supplies in his coat pocket that was, if he was honest, longer than it needed to be. He did not go to the schoolhouse during school hours. He knew that much she was working, and her work was important, and he would not interrupt it. He went to Calloway's, sold his pelts at a fair price, bought his supplies, talked to James Calloway about the winter weather and the state of things generally. He was at the counter wrapping a length of rope when the bell above the store door rang and Eliza Dawson came in, her cheeks red from the cold and a shopping list in her hand, and she stopped when she saw him. 10 days, she said. "I had supplies to get," he said. "Of course," she said, and she was smiling, and it was the full version of the smile, not the careful, composed one. He waited for her while she did her shopping, and they walked back to Mrs. Marsh's together through the winter afternoon, their breath smoking in the cold air. She told him about the school, 17 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14, with the full spectrum of prior education from none to surprisingly accomplished, and a particular girl named Pearl Hagen who was 12 years old and had a mathematical mind that Eliza described as the most remarkable thing I have encountered in an educational setting, with a wonder and delight in it that told him how much she loved this work. He told her about the mountains. A herd of elk he had seen moving through the upper valley, 200 animals or more. the kind of sight that stopped you regardless of how many times you had seen it. A wolverine that had gotten into one of his trap sets and had shown absolutely no interest in being discouraged. A wolverine, she said. I have never seen one. You do not want to meet one on bad terms, he said, but at a distance in good light they are something to see, built like they were made from pure obstinacy. She laughed. That is a description I can respect. He had supper at Mrs. Marsh's that night. Clara Marsh was a magnificent cook, the kind of cook who took what was available and made it into something that justified the effort of existing. And the table was genuinely good roast elk with onions and a dried apple pie that was the best thing Eli had eaten in longer than he could honestly say. He sat across from Eliza at the table, and they talked with a fluency and ease that felt, to him, both new and somehow familiar, the way a path feels when you have not walked it before but it is the right direction anyway. He left for the mountains the next morning. He came back in 9 days. This went on through January and into February, each visit a little longer, each departure a little harder to make. He was honest with himself about what was happening. He had not been dishonest with himself in a long time, not since the period after Harlan's death when dishonesty had been a survival mechanism. He was falling in love with Eliza Dawson. The recognition arrived not as a surprise but as a confirmation, like checking a calculation you had already suspected was right. The question was what to do about it. He was not an impulsive man. He was a man who thought carefully before he acted, who checked the ice before he put his weight on it. And there were real considerations here. He lived in a cabin 4 miles from the nearest town in the mountains of Montana Territory, and his life was solitary and physically demanding, and offered none of the comforts that a woman like Eliza Dawson, educated, capable, with a life of purpose and usefulness in front of her, had any obligation to accept. He was 31 years old and set in his ways in the particular way of a man who had arranged his life around his own needs for so long that he was not entirely certain he was capable of arranging it around someone else's. These were real considerations. He gave them real weight. But he also thought about her at 3 in the morning when the wind came off the peaks and the cabin walls contracted in the cold. He thought about her laugh, and the way she spoke about Pearl Hagen's mathematical mind, and the expression on her face when she had put her hand on that schoolteacher's desk for the first time. He thought about 10 years alone in these mountains and what it amounted to, and what he wanted the next 10 years to amount to. He came into town on a Thursday in early February and went directly to the schoolhouse, arriving just as school let out, and stood by the fence watching the children pour out into the cold afternoon light. They were a lively assortment, bundled in every available piece of wool and leather, shouting and pushing and making the particular noise of children who have been contained indoors for several hours. Pearl Hagen came out toward the back of the crowd, a serious-faced girl with red hair and ink on her fingers, talking to another girl of roughly the same age with great intensity. He could not hear what she was saying, but her hands were moving in the quick, precise way of someone explaining mathematics, and he smiled at it. Eliza came out last, locking the door behind her, and saw him at the fence. She came to him. Pearl Hagen has apparently determined the most efficient route for the school wagon to pick up all 17 students using a method she derived herself, she said, by way of greeting. She drew a diagram. It is entirely correct. That is a remarkable child, he said. She is, Eliza said, with a warmth that was almost maternal. They walked. They walked to the far end of the street and then north along the creek bank, where the ice was thick and gray and the cottonwoods stood bare above it, and the town fell behind them, and it was just the two of them and the cold air and the sound of the water moving somewhere under the ice. He had not planned what to say. He trusted himself to find the words when they were needed, which was not a method he would have recommended to anyone else, but which was the only method he had. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said. She was looking at the frozen creek. "I am not a man who does a great deal of talking around things," he said. "I have noticed," she said, There was something careful in her voice, something that was listening hard. "I have been coming into town more than my supply schedule requires," he said. "I have also noticed that," she said. She turned to look at him. "I think you know why," he said. She held his gaze. "I think I do," she said. "I would rather hear you say it." He had given her that. He took a breath of cold mountain air. "I am in love with you," he said. "I did not expect to be when I carried you out of that snow. I did not intend to be. It is not something I have managed to argue myself out of in the past 6 weeks, and I have tried because I am aware of the complications. But there it is." She was quiet. The creek murmured beneath its ice. "What are the complications you have tried to use against it?" she asked. "My life," he said. "It is not what most women would choose. I live alone in the mountains, 4 miles from town, in a cabin that is comfortable but not," he paused. "Not what you came from, not Cincinnati." "I left Cincinnati," she said. "You left a bad situation in Cincinnati," he said. "That is not the same as choosing a cabin in the Bitterroots." "No," she said, "it is not." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "Eli, when I was sitting in that snow 3 miles from the pass and I knew I was not going to be able to get up again, what I felt was not fear of dying. Not exactly. What I felt was a very particular grief about the life I had not yet managed to live, the life I had been working toward. And that life was not Cincinnati, and it was not Gerald Pfeiffer's parlor." She paused. "I cannot tell you exactly what it is. I am still discovering it, but it is here. It is in that schoolhouse with those 17 children. It is in watching Pearl Hagen invent her own mathematics." She looked up at him. "It is in standing by a fence at school letting out and seeing you there and having my heart do something entirely unreasonable." He looked at her for a long moment. "I have been doing the same calculus," she said. "I am not unaware of the complications. But I have also been doing what I do when I see a complicated problem, which is looking at it carefully to see whether the complications are real or whether they are fear wearing the costume of reason." "And," he said. "The complications are real," she said, "and they are not insurmountable." She met his eyes. "I would like to know you better. I would like you to know me better. I think that is where this goes if you are willing." He reached out and took her hand carefully over the gloves, Harlan's gloves, and held it. "I am willing," he said. She smiled, and the smile was the full one, the one that reached everything. Spring came to the Bitterroots the way it always came, reluctantly and then all at once. The snowpack retreating first from the south-facing slopes and then gradually, grudgingly, from the higher elevations. The world revealing itself in layers like a painting emerging from beneath whitewash. Eli watched it come with a different feeling than he had in previous years. The change of seasons had always meant something practical to him: new trap lines, new ranges, summer travel that the winter made impossible. Now it also meant that the trail between his cabin and Harlow Creek was easier to manage. And easier to manage meant he spent more of his evenings at Mrs. Marsh's table with Eliza across from him. He also, for the first time in 4 years, began to see his cabin with different eyes. He had built it to function, not to be lived in as much as to be survived in, and walking through it in March with Eliza's voice in his head asking questions about everything. She had only seen it those 4 days in December. He noticed what was missing and what was worn, and what was well done and what was not. He replaced the window glass, which had a crack in it. He built a second chair. He fixed the porch step that had been rotting since autumn. He did these things methodically and without telling himself exactly why, though he knew exactly why. In April, he brought her to the cabin for the first time since December. He came to town on a Saturday, which was a school-free day, and they rode up together in the clear spring morning on Carver and Rue, with the mountains white above and green beginning below. And she saw the cabin in new light, and he saw it through her eyes. She walked through it slowly, and he stood in the doorway watching her take it in: the hearthstone, the trunk with Harlan's things that he had never quite moved, the shelf of books he had accumulated over the years, the window with the repaired glass that gave a clear view of the slope and the pines. "You built all of this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it," he said. The chimney I had help with. A man called Reuben Trask who was wintering in the valley. He knew stonework. She put her hand on the hearthstone. "It is a good house," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said things that she meant without decoration. He made coffee on the fire. They sat on the porch in the thin April sunshine and drank it and looked at the mountains together, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that does not need filling because it is itself a form of conversation. He told her about the mountain seasons, what came and went, what the summers were like, which he described with a genuine enthusiasm that he did not usually bother with because there had been no one to enthuse to. She listened and asked questions, and he watched her face as she assembled this landscape in her imagination, filing it alongside the winter version she already knew. "I could come up sometimes," she said carefully. "On Saturdays when school is not in session, if that would be—" She paused. "If you would want that." "Yes," he said, simple, no qualifications. She smiled at her coffee cup. On one of those Saturdays in May, they were walking up the eastern slope behind the cabin, following a game trail into the aspens where the new leaves were the precise green of something just beginning, when she stopped and turned to him with a directness that was characteristically Eliza. "I need to tell you the rest of the Cincinnati story," she said. "If this is going where I think it is going." "Tell me," he said. She told him. The full version. Gerald Pfeiffer had not simply been unkind in the subtle ways she had mentioned before. He had been at various points in the engagement, frightening, a man whose anger was a specific and calculated instrument, used when he wanted compliance and withdrawn when he had achieved it. She had never been in serious physical danger, she believed, but the particular damage that kind of persistent fear inflicted on a person was its own category of harm, and she had spent the year of that engagement becoming a slightly smaller and more careful version of herself, and the month since leaving had been, among other things, the work of remembering who she was before that particular shrinking. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, they were standing in the aspens with the new leaves moving above them and the light coming through in pieces, and he said, "Thank you for telling me. I needed you to know," she said, "because it affects how I am sometimes. I am less immediately trusting than I might be otherwise. I startle at certain things. It is not about you, but I wanted you to know the reason." "I know," he said, and then, because it was true and she needed to hear it, "You are safe with me. I do not say that as a promise about the future. I say it as a description of who I am. You are safe with me." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face that she had not been fully aware was there resolved very quietly, like ice releasing in spring. "I know," she said. "I have known it since the night in the cabin when you sat with your back to me and let me sleep." She paused. A man who wants to use his power does not turn his back. He had not thought of it in those terms. He thought of it now and recognized it as true. She reached out and took his hand, not over the gloves this time. She was not wearing the gloves today. It was warm enough, but skin to skin, her fingers lacing through his. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and then he kissed her, there in the aspens with the new leaves coming in and the mountains white above the green below. It was not a tentative kiss. He was not a tentative man, not in the ways that mattered, and she was not a tentative woman. And the kiss had in it something of everything that had accumulated since December, the 4 days in the cabin, the 2 miles of careful talk, the Saturday mornings and the supply run visits, and all the silences that had said as much as words. When they broke apart, she was looking at him with an expression that was clear and direct and entirely unguarded, and he thought it was probably the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. She laughed, and so did he, and they walked back down the mountain in the spring light with their hands still linked. Summer in Harlow Creek and the surrounding country was a different world from winter. The valley floor turned green and then golden, and the mountains above shed their snow down to the permanent fields on the highest peaks, and the sky was wide and blue and went on for what seemed like a geologic distance. The days were long and the work was relentless in the way that summer always demanded on the frontier, everything that could not be done in winter being done now, double time, because winter was coming again in 6 months and it kept its own schedule. Eli worked hard that summer. He guided 2 parties of land surveyors through the mountain passes for the territorial government, work that paid better than trapping and took him away from the cabin for a week at a time. And each time he came back to Harlow Creek, he felt the return more keenly than the departure. He was becoming familiar to the town in the way that a man who had been peripheral becomes central, though he could not have said precisely when that had happened. He ate dinner at the Copper Nail and knew the ranchers by name. He helped James Calloway shift a load of lumber that had come in by freight wagon. He fixed the hinges on the schoolhouse door one morning before school started because he had noticed they were working loose and had the tools in his pack. Eliza noticed everything. He was learning that about her. She had an observational precision that was very nearly as good as his own, honed by a different set of years in different terrain but pointing in the same direction. She noticed the hinges, and she noticed who had fixed them, and she noticed what it cost him to do thoughtful things without announcement. "You fixed the door," she said that evening. "The hinges were going," he said. "Thank you," she said. Just that, no elaboration, because she had also learned by now how he received gratitude directly and without ceremony was best. In July, Henry Alcott's wife, a thin woman named Joanna who had been unwell since spring, died of a lung ailment. It was the kind of loss that Harlow Creek felt communally, because everyone knew everyone, and Joanna Alcott had been one of those people who were the invisible architecture of a community, the one who organized the church suppers and visited the sick and remembered the children's birthdays and kept the particular kind of warmth alive in a settlement that might otherwise be all hardship and commerce. Her death left a space. Eli went to the funeral. He stood at the back of the crooked steepled church with his hat in his hands, and he listened to the preacher speak about Joanna, and he felt the particular weight of mortality that he knew better than most people in that room. Eliza sat in the pews with Clara Marsh, and when she came out of the church afterward and found him there, they simply fell into step together, walking side by side through the July heat, not speaking for a while. "She was good to me when I arrived," Eliza said. "She came to Mrs. Marsh's 3 days after I got here with a pie just to welcome me. She did not have to do that." "No," he said, "the town misses her already." "Yes." They walked to the creek and sat on a log and watched the water running fast and clear in the summer melt, nothing like the frozen thing it was in winter. And she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there until the sun was well past its peak. He proposed to her in August. He had thought about how to do it and had eventually arrived, as he usually arrived, at simplicity. They were on the porch of his cabin on a Saturday evening, the mountains turning pink and then red and then purple in the sunset, and she was talking about Pearl Hagen again. The girl had won a mathematics competition organized by correspondence with 2 other territorial schools, the first time Harlow Creek had won anything of that kind, and her face had that quality he loved, the particular illumination she had when she talked about something she cared about. He waited for a moment's pause and then said, "Eliza, will you marry me?" She went quiet. She looked at him. The mountains were doing extraordinary things behind him, all that alpenglow, and she was very still. "I have been thinking about asking you that for 3 months," he said. "I have been trying to work out the right way to say it, and I have come to the conclusion that there is no right way, there is only saying it." "Yes," she said. She said it immediately without the pause he had expected, and then she said it again. "Yes, Eli, yes." He had a ring. He had ordered it from the jeweler in Missoula, had sent the letter in June, and it had arrived with the July freight. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because turquoise was the color of the Montana sky in summer, and he had thought she would understand why. She looked at it when he put it on her finger and then looked up at him. "The sky," she said. "Yes," he said. She kissed him with a thoroughness that told him she did not have words for it, and he held her in the purple mountain dusk and felt something unlock in his chest that he had not known was locked. They set the wedding for October, which gave them 2 months of preparation and fell conveniently before the worst of the winter weather. Harlow Creek responded to the news with the particular enthusiasm of a small community for whom any celebration was a significant event. Clara Marsh began planning a reception dinner before the engagement was a week old. James Calloway sent to Missoula for fabric. Henry Alcott, still raw from his own loss but genuine in his happiness for them, offered the use of the church. There were practical decisions to make. Eliza would not give up the school. This was not a question. She made it clear immediately, and he agreed immediately because it was her work and it mattered, and there was no universe in which he would have asked her otherwise. But the cabin was 4 miles from town, which meant a daily ride in good weather and an impossibility in bad. They talked about it thoroughly, over multiple evenings, with the practicality that both of them brought to problems. They decided that she would continue boarding at Mrs. Marsh's through the school week, riding up to the cabin on Fridays after school, returning to town on Sunday evenings. He would come to town at least twice during the week, and he would over the winter expand the cabin. There was room on the south side for another room, properly built, with a real floor rather than packed earth, and a proper storeroom, so that by next winter it was a place she could live in more fully. She came with him one weekend in September and they walked the planned expansion together, her with a stick marking out dimensions in the dirt, him following with his own assessment, and they argued pleasantly about the size of the additional room. She wanted more space and he thought less was structurally simpler and reached a compromise that was closer to what she wanted, which he had fully expected and which was, he had to admit, probably better. "You gave in," she said, looking at the final marked dimensions. "I deferred to your expertise," he said. "I have no expertise in cabin building." "You have expertise in living," he said, "which is more to the point." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had come to recognize as her surprised by him face. "That is possibly the most generous thing you have ever said to me," she said. "It is a true thing," he said. "That is all." The wedding was on the 14th of October, 1880. The day was cold and clear, the aspens in the creek bottom already stripped of their leaves, the mountains behind the town white with the first permanent snow of the season. The church was full, which meant roughly 60 people, which was most of Harlow Creek and a number of the surrounding ranchers and homesteaders who had made the ride in for the occasion. Pearl Hagen was there with her parents, sitting in the third row with an expression of solemn significance that made Eliza's eyes go bright when she saw it. Eli stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which had been aired out and brushed by Clara Marsh with a thoroughness that brooked no argument, and watched Eliza come down the aisle. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, not white, a practical choice for a practical woman, and in that deep blue against her dark hair, she was more beautiful than anything these mountains had offered him, which was saying something. She walked with her back straight and her eyes directly on him, and there was nothing in her face but intention. No performance, no ceremony for its own sake. She was walking to him because she had decided to walk to him, and the decision was complete. He took her hands when she reached him and held them, and the preacher spoke, and he said his words when it was time, and she said hers, and when it was done they were married, and the church erupted in the kind of spontaneous noise that 60 people make when they are genuinely glad, and James Calloway's baritone was audible above all of it. The reception at Clara Marsh's was, by the standards of Harlow Creek, a remarkable event. 3 different women had contributed to the food, producing a table that included roast elk and wild turkey and sweet potatoes from the Alcott garden, and 3 different kinds of pie. And someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a mouth organ. And by 9 o'clock the parlor had been pushed back to accommodate dancing, which was not something Eli Sullivan had done since Ohio, but which he undertook now with a willingness that Eliza clearly found endearing. "You cannot dance," she said, laughing, as they turned in something that was approximately a waltz. "I am dancing," he said. "You are moving in the general direction of dancing," she said. "It is charming." "High praise," he said. She danced well, as it happened, light on her feet, with a natural sense of rhythm that she put down, when he commented on it, to years of teaching children and therefore learning to move in the world that children occupied. He thought it was probably just her, the same quality that made her good at everything she did with her body, riding, walking in difficult terrain, reaching the high shelves of Callaway's store on her toes without asking for help. They rode up to the cabin that night late, under a sky so full of stars it seemed excessive, the horses moving carefully in the dark with the sureness of animals who knew this trail. She rode beside him en route, who was now essentially her horse in all but name, and they did not talk much, just moved together through the cold night with the sound of hoofbeats on the hard ground and the stars above. And he thought that this was what happiness felt like when it had weight to it, not the lightness of relief, but the solidity of something real. The cabin was warm when they arrived because he had laid a fire before coming to town that morning and banked it carefully, and it caught again easily with the addition of 2 logs. She stood in the middle of the cabin that was now hers as much as his and looked around it with a new expression, something that was both familiar and fresh, the way you look at a place you know from the outside that you have just entered for the first time. "Our home," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned and came to him, and that night was everything that had been building since December of the year before, since the moment he had found her in the snow and carried her out of it and sat with his back to her by the fire and said nothing until she was warm. The first winter of their marriage was the most content winter Eli Sullivan had ever spent. He had expected the adjustment of it. 2 people are not one, and 2 people's habits and rhythms are not the same. But what he found was that the adjustments came more easily than he had anticipated, because Eliza was a woman who approached the practical arrangements of life with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else, and she was genuinely interested in learning how his life worked rather than trying to make his life match a version she had brought with her. She learned to read the weather signs he showed her, the particular quality of the light before a storm, the way the horses behaved when pressure was dropping. She learned to bank the fire correctly, to check the woodpile's adequacy for the temperature range, to read the creek ice. He learned in turn that she had strong opinions about how a kitchen should be organized, that she needed an hour in the morning before she was fully conversational, and that she kept a journal that was clearly private and that he never looked at, which she noticed and appreciated without mentioning directly. She rode to town 5 days a week through October and November, and he came in twice a week, and on Saturdays she stayed in the cabin and graded papers by the fire while he worked in the barn or on the expansion he had started on the south wall. And the sound of her pen moving and the sound of his hammer came through the log wall and mixed in the cold air outside, and if you had been there to hear it, it would have sounded like a life. December came with the full winter behind it, and the expansion was not finished. He had known it would not be, had planned for what was versus what was ideal, but the main structure was up, and the new room had a roof and walls and would be finishable by February. She looked at it with her practical eye and said it was perfectly good for now, and he agreed, and they spent the first anniversary of her nearly dying in the snow by the fire in their cabin, eating a meal she had made from what they had and which was, characteristically, better than it had any right to be. "A year ago today," she said. "Give or take a day," he said. "I found you the 16th. "Give or take a day," she agreed. She had her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her feet tucked up under her on the chair, and she was looking at him with a steadiness that had become, over the course of this year, the thing he came home to. "I think about what would have happened if you had taken a different trail." "I do not think about that," he said. "Why not?" "Because it did not happen," he said. She considered this. "You are a very practical man, Eli Sullivan." "You knew that from the first night," he said. "I did," she said. "It was the second thing I noticed about you." "What was the first?" She smiled. "That you were safe," she said. "I noticed that first." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "And then I noticed how your eyes look in firelight, but I did not intend to tell you that for at least another year or two." He laughed, and she laughed, and it was the best December evening either of them had spent in a long time. By the spring of 1881, Pearl Hagen had become such a fixture of their life that she might as well have been a member of the family. Eliza had been working with her on advanced mathematics outside of regular school hours, and her parents, practical farming people who were not themselves mathematically inclined, but who recognized their daughter's extraordinary quality and respected it, had supported this arrangement with a gratitude that Eliza received with characteristic directness. Pearl came to the cabin twice a month on Saturdays, riding the family's brown mule with her notebooks in a bag, and she and Eliza worked at the table while Eli made coffee, and occasionally contributed a geometric observation that caused Pearl to look at him with a reevaluation that he found quietly amusing. "You understand mathematics," Pearl said to him one Saturday morning as if revising a previous assessment. "Some," he said. "He navigates by mathematics," Eliza said, without looking up from the notebook. "Latitude, longitude, gradient, he does it in his head." Pearl looked at him with an expression that was very nearly reverence. "It is practical mathematics," he said, "not elegant." "All mathematics is elegant," Pearl said, with the certainty of a 12-year-old who has found her religion. He looked at Eliza. She looked at him. They were, without words, sharing the same thought, which was that Pearl Hagen was going to do remarkable things, and the fact that she had ended up in a Harlow Creek schoolroom in the care of Eliza Sullivan was one of those improbable gifts that the frontier occasionally offered to make up for its more consistent brutality. In April of 1881, Eliza told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before she had had her quiet hour, which told him she had been holding the information since the previous day and could not hold it any longer. He was at the stove when she said it, and he put down what he was holding, turned around, and looked at her sitting at the table with her hands in her lap and an expression that was both certain and waiting. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in both of his. "Are you glad?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He said it simply and completely. "Are you?" "Yes," she said, and then her voice did something small and unsteady. "I am a little frightened." "I know," he said. "That is reasonable. Tell me it will be all right," she said. He looked at her steadily. He was not a man who made promises he could not keep, and she knew that, and what he said was, "I will be here for every part of it. Whatever happens, I will be right here." He paused. "And you are the strongest person I have ever met. I have evidence of this." She made a sound that was half a laugh and half a breath. "That is a good answer," she said. He arranged for Dr. Finch to see her monthly, and he came into town for every appointment, which Dr. Finch noticed and mentioned to James Calloway, who told Clara Marsh, who told essentially everyone, and the result was a particular warmth directed toward Eli Sullivan in Harlow Creek that he absorbed with good grace and some bemusement. He also built the second room of the expansion with a focused speed that anyone watching would have recognized as a man with a deadline, and by June it was complete, a proper room with a plank floor and a real window and enough space to be something more than functional. Eliza taught school through June, stopping only when the school year ended for summer, and she spent the summer in the cabin, which was when she truly came to know it in all its seasons. She took over the kitchen garden he had only half-heartedly maintained, and she made it into something productive with the same methodical energy she brought to everything, persuading things to grow in the short mountain summer by sheer will and good soil management. She put in beans and turnips and squash and an optimistic row of carrots that produced, by September, a quantity of carrots that was sufficient for the rest of the year, and which she preserved in the root cellar with a satisfaction that was entirely justified. She missed teaching. He could see it. She did not complain about it. She was not a complaining woman. But there was a particular quality to her energy in summer that was looking for direction, and he saw it find direction in the garden, and in the reading she did, and in the letters she wrote to Pearl Hagen twice a week, continuing their mathematics work by correspondence. He thought about this, and he thought about what their life was going to look like with a child in it, and one evening in July he brought up the question of what she wanted to do about school in the fall. "I will be confined through September at least," she said matter-of-factly. "I know," he said, and after that, she was quiet for a moment. "I want to go back," she said, "when it is possible, when we have arranged how to manage it." "We will arrange it," he said. "You do not mind?" she asked. "I married a schoolteacher," he said. "I knew what that meant." She looked at him. "Not everyone would see it that way." "I am not everyone," he said. "No," she said, "you are distinctly not." Their son was born on the first day of October, 1881. Eli had been awake for the prior 20 hours, and Dr. Finch had ridden up from town in the early morning hours. And Clara Marsh had come with him because Clara Marsh was the kind of woman who arrived where she was needed with the certainty of weather. Eli had been present for as much of it as he had been allowed to be, and had stood outside the bedroom door for the hours he had not been allowed to be present, listening to sounds that are the particular territory of any man waiting for the outcome of a birth, which is to say that he experienced those hours as among the longest of his life. When the door opened and Clara Marsh's red face appeared with an expression of thorough satisfaction on it, and she said, "A boy, Sullivan, and both of them are fine." He sat down heavily on the nearest thing, which happened to be the edge of the porch, and put his head in his hands for a moment and breathed. He was allowed in soon after. Eliza was exhausted in a way that was visible in every line of her face, and she was also, unmistakably, triumphant. She had the baby in her arms, and she was looking at him with the particular astonishment of a person who has just done the most significant and unprecedented thing of their life, and is still processing the fact of it. She looked up when Eli came in, and her expression shifted to something that was directed entirely at him, something so open and full that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was very small and very present, with dark hair like his mother and eyes that were, in this first hour, the unfocused blue of all newborns. He was making small sounds, moving his fingers with the new deliberate randomness of a person who has very recently discovered that they have fingers. "Hello," Eli said to him. He did not say it out loud. He said it in the way you said things that mattered, which was quietly and directly, and the baby's hand moved near his face, and Eliza rested her head against Eli's shoulder, and Clara Marsh closed the door softly behind her. They named him James for James Calloway, who had been a consistent and uncomplicated kindness in both their lives, and who upon being informed of the honor spent a full minute clearing his throat before he could speak. James Sullivan was a fine baby, and then a fine infant, and then, in the accelerated way of children, a fine toddler, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's gray stubbornness, and a laugh that came early and came often. Eliza went back to teaching in February of 1882, when James was 4 months old, with the arrangement that Clara Marsh, who had become, in the organic way of genuine affection, something very close to a grandmother, watched him on the school days when Eliza was in town. Eli adjusted his schedule around this with the same practical ease he brought to adjusting around any terrain, and the life they had built accommodated the child as it had accommodated everything else, by making room, and by being the kind of life that had room to make. Pearl Hagen, now 15 and exceptional, was by this time helping with the younger students in the afternoons, assisting Eliza with a competence and maturity that had made the school measurably more effective. Pearl had already received a letter from a college in Oregon about the possibility of a scholarship, the first letter of its kind ever received by anyone connected to Harlow Creek, and the town had responded to the news with a pride that was entirely collective and entirely genuine. Eliza had written the letter of recommendation herself, 4 pages, with a specificity and force that had clearly reached whoever read it. In the summer of 1882, Eli was asked by the territorial government to guide a survey expedition into the northern Bitterroots. 3 weeks of work in country he knew well, and that was, as of that summer, beginning to attract the attention of land speculators and timber companies, men with money and instruments from the east, looking at the mountains and seeing something other than mountains. Eli went because the work was important and paid well, and because the survey maps, if done honestly, would serve people who needed them. He left Eliza and James at the cabin with Rue and with a neighbor from the valley below, a homesteader named Will Dobbins, who had become a reliable presence over the past year, checking in every few days. He was gone 22 days. He came back to find the kitchen garden at its peak, James walking, actually walking, 3 steps and a magnificent collapse, and Eliza sitting on the porch in the evening light reading a letter with an expression that made him ask immediately what had happened. She held up the letter. It was from Pearl Hagen's parents. Pearl had been awarded the scholarship. He sat down beside her on the porch, and she leaned against him, and he read the letter over her shoulder, and then they sat there for a while with the letter between them and James on the porch floor between their feet, pulling himself up on Eli's boot with the determined single-mindedness of a person who has decided that standing is the only acceptable state of affairs. "You did that," he said. "She did that," Eliza said. "I just made sure someone knew." "That is what good teachers do," he said. She turned her face up to him. She looked in that moment like the best version of everything she had been when he had carried her out of the snow, all the potential of it fully realized, warm and alive and exactly herself. He kissed her forehead, and she made a sound that was contentment without words, and James successfully stood for a full 3 seconds before sitting down hard and looking surprised about it. In the late fall of 1882, a thing happened in Harlow Creek that needed tending. There had been a dispute between a cattle operation moving in from the south and several homesteader families in the valley, the Dobbins family, the Hagens, and 2 others over water rights to a branch of the creek that the cattlemen intended to divert for a watering tank. The cattlemen were backed by a land agent out of Helena, and the homesteaders had no legal representation and were frankly outmatched in terms of resources. Henry Alcott organized a meeting at the church. Eli went because Will Dobbins was his neighbor and had been good to his family, and because he had been watching this particular kind of contest play out across the territory for years. The pattern by which large outside interests dismantled the arrangements that small communities had built for themselves, not always through force, but often through the more insidious mechanism of legal complexity applied to people who could not afford to counter it. It was one of the persistent injustices of the frontier, the way the land that small people had broken themselves to build on was perpetually at risk from the interests of larger money, and Eli Sullivan had no patience for the mechanism regardless of its legality. He spoke at the meeting with a directness that focused the room. He had been to Missoula on the survey expedition and had made contacts there, one of whom was a territorial lawyer who had handled water rights disputes before. He wrote a letter on behalf of the homesteaders that night at Callaway's store and sent it on the morning stage. The lawyer came 3 weeks later, reviewed the situation, and identified the specific legal standing the homesteaders had under the water allocation recorded when the valley was first surveyed, a survey that Eli had happened to assist with in 1875. The case was documented and filed. The cattle operations agent, faced with actual legal resistance, retreated to a compromise that left the creek branch in shared use, which was not everything but was considerably more than nothing. Will Dobbins shook Eli's hand afterward with a grip that said more than the words he could not quite find. Eli shook it back. "That is what neighbors do," he said. Will Dobbins nodded, and that was enough said. Eliza had been at the meeting. She had sat with Clara Marsh and said nothing during the meeting itself, because she had correctly assessed that the voices that needed to be heard at that meeting were the homesteaders' own voices, and had directed her energy afterward into making sure that the story was recorded. She wrote it up in a long letter to the Helena newspaper, which ran it on page 2. The first time Harlow Creek had appeared in any regional publication, and the first time the specific water rights issue had received any public attention in the territory. "You did not tell me you were writing that," Eli said when he saw it. "I was not certain they would run it," she said. "What made you do it?" She looked at him steadily. "Because things that happen to people who do not have the means to make them known should be known regardless," she said. "Because the injustice of it does not cease because the people suffering it are too small or too tired to shout about it. Someone should shout." She paused. "I am a teacher. I know how to write things people can read." He looked at her and felt the thing he had felt in the Aspens, the thing in the church on their wedding day, the thing when she had come down the street toward him that first October in her gray dress with snow in her hair, the cumulative and still growing conviction that Eliza Dawson Sullivan was the most fundamentally good person he had ever known, and that some version of him had understood this in the first hours, in the cabin, watching her drink broth from a tin cup. "I love you," he said. He said it with the same plainness he brought to all the things that were most true, without elaboration. She looked at him with her dark eyes and she said, "I know, Eli, and I love you. In the most complete way I know how." She paused, "which I am told I am capable of saying to my own husband without being embarrassed about it." "Who told you that?" "Clara Marsh," she said. "She is full of useful information." He laughed, and she laughed, and James, who was on the floor and had been listening to the conversation with the intense focus of a 13-month-old who understood tone if not content, laughed too, at the sound of them. And it was the best sound in the cabin that winter evening, and it filled the rooms that they had built together and went out through the new window and dissolved in the cold December air over the mountains. In the spring of 1883, they planted the kitchen garden together for the first time, all three of them, James in a sling on Eli's back while his father worked the soil with a fork, and his mother walked the rows with seeds, talking to James as she went about what would grow from each kind of seed, because she was, always and everywhere, a teacher. The sun was warm on the south-facing slope, and the mountains were still white above, and green was just beginning below, and Eli turned and looked at his wife, in the morning light, seeds in her hand, talking to their son about the improbable faith required to put something small and dry in the ground and wait for it to become something alive. And he stood still for a moment with the garden fork in his hands and simply looked at her. She glanced up and found him watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You." She raised an eyebrow, which he had learned meant she knew exactly what he was doing and was permitting it. He went back to his digging. She went back to her seeds. James patted the back of his father's head with a small, purposeful hand. The second child came in the winter of 1884, on a night of hard snow when the world outside was nothing but white, and Dr. Finch made the ride up from town in the dark with the deliberate courage of a man who understood his work to be necessary regardless of conditions, which it was. Clara Marsh was again there, because of course she was. Eli was there, as he had been the first time, present for what he could be present for, and steady outside the door for the rest. This one was a girl. They named her Ruth, after Eliza's grandmother, a woman Eliza had described over the years as the person in her family who had most consistently understood her. "Ruth," he said, looking at her. She was pink and definitive, with a quantity of dark hair that had not been there with James and a focused look in her new eyes that suggested she was already forming opinions. "Ruth Sullivan," Eliza said and smiled. "She looks like she has something to say." "She takes after her mother," Eli said. "Heaven help us," Eliza said, and she was laughing, which was, given the circumstances, either courage or joy, and he thought it was both. James, now too, regarded his sister with the comprehensive suspicion of a toddler presented with a permanent change to his domestic arrangements. And then, over the course of a week, with a growing proprietary interest that expressed itself in wanting to show her things, his blocks, his cup, his picture of a horse that hung by the window. She was not yet capable of appreciating these offerings, but he offered them with consistency and a generosity that made Eli watch him with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with anything he had taught and everything to do with who his son was. Pearl Hagen left for Oregon in September of 1884. Eliza and Eli both rode to Harlow Creek to see her off at the stage depot, and Pearl hugged Eliza for a long time and then, with the solemnity of a 15-year-old who has decided that this moment requires it, shook Eli's hand. "Thank you," she said to Eliza. "Thank yourself," Eliza said. "The ability was always yours." "You saw it when no one else thought to look," Pearl said. Eliza pressed her hands. "Write to me," she said. "About everything, the mathematics especially." Pearl smiled, the rare full smile that transformed her serious face. "And you write back," she said, "with all the news of Harlow Creek." The stage left in a cloud of dust and noise, and Pearl's red hair was the last thing visible in the window, and then she was gone, and Eliza stood looking down the empty road for a moment before she turned away. "Are you all right?" Eli asked. "Yes," she said, she was. He could see it. The particular sadness of watching something good go forward was not the same as grief, and she knew the difference. "She is going to do extraordinary things." "Yes," he said. "And some of it is because of me," she said. "That is not nothing. That is everything," he said. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she took his arm, and they walked back up the street together toward where the horses were tied in front of Callaway's. The years went on. James grew into a tall, thoughtful boy who had, it turned out, both his mother's love of words and his father's relationship with the outdoor world, and who spent his Saturdays alternately reading the books that accumulated on the cabin shelf and following Eli through the mountains, learning the things that could not be learned from books. Ruth was, as Eliza had foreseen, a person with a great deal to say, and the energy she brought to saying it was remarkable. She talked to horses, to birds, to the creek in spring flood, to anyone who would listen, and many who would not. And she was funny, with a dry humor that both her parents recognized as a family trait. In 1886, Eliza received a letter from Pearl Hagen, now 18 and in her second year at the Oregon College, describing a mathematical theorem she had been working on that had attracted the attention of her professors as potentially original work. The letter went on for 6 pages in Pearl's precise small handwriting. Eliza read it aloud at dinner and then pinned it to the wall of the classroom and told her students about it. And the fact that a girl from Harlow Creek had done something no one expected rattled around in that schoolroom for weeks, doing its particular work on young minds that needed to see what was possible. Eli had by this time expanded his guiding work, taking on more survey commissions and, in the summers, occasionally guiding parties of naturalists and scientists through the mountain country. Men and one woman from universities and natural history associations who wanted to catalog what was in these mountains before the coming wave of settlement changed it. He had found, to his mild surprise, that he enjoyed this work not just practically, but in the way he had never expected to enjoy the company of strangers, which was to say that their interest in the mountain world reminded him of his own first years in it, and he found himself becoming, against the grain of his natural taciturnity, something close to a narrator of this place. He told Eliza about this one evening, and she laughed with the delight of someone who has always seen this quality in a person and is pleased to see the person find it themselves. "You have always been a teacher," she said. "That is your territory," he said. "Territory can be shared," she said. "You are the person who taught me what the light means before a storm and where the snow bridges lie and how to read ice. That is teaching." He thought about this. "It is different," he said. "All teaching is different depending on what you are teaching and who needs to learn it," she said. "The principle is the same." She looked at him with amusement. "Did you think you married outside your world, Eli Sullivan? You live in your world, I live in mine, and they have turned out to be the same world." He sat with that for a moment and found it to be exactly true. In the October of 1887, James Sullivan turned 6 years old, and Eli Sullivan, in what he would later describe as a moment of impulse that turned out to be wisdom, left his guide work earlier than usual on a Tuesday afternoon and came into Harlow Creek to pick his son up from his first day of school and walk home with him. He arrived to find James in animated conversation with a girl named Clara, the daughter of one of the new homesteader families, about whether horses or mules were smarter, a question both children held strong and reasoned views about. He stood at the fence and watched his son argue with the focused confidence of a person who has been listened to enough to trust that his words have weight, and felt the specific pride of a parent watching their child be, unambiguously, themselves. On the way home, James asked him approximately 40 questions about animal intelligence, snow formation, the territorial government, what happened to letters when you put them in the post box, and whether stars were different in summer than winter. Eli answered all of them fully the way Eliza answered questions. "How do you know so much?" James asked at some point. "I have been in these mountains for a long time," Eli said, "paying attention." "Is paying attention the same as learning?" James asked. Eli looked at his son. "Yes," he said, "exactly the same." James nodded with the gravity of a 6-year-old accepting a fact. "Mama says paying attention is the most important thing," he said. "Your mama is right," Eli said. "She is right about most things," James said, "but not everything." "No," Eli said. "What is she wrong about?" "She thinks carrots are good," James said with tremendous feeling. Eli laughed so hard he had to stop walking. James looked at him with the combined expressions of mild offense and satisfaction at having caused the effect. He was very much his mother's son in that moment, and very much himself. The cabin in the Bitterroots, which had started as one man's deliberate solitude, was by the autumn of 1887 a place of a particular and irreplaceable fullness. The expansion Eli had built was complete and had been added to once more, so that the original single room had become 3, with a proper kitchen and the original main room and 2 small bedrooms, one for James and Ruth, divided by a curtain, and one for Eli and Eliza, with a window that looked north toward the permanent snow on the highest peaks. The kitchen garden had by this time achieved something approaching prosperity, supplemented in the summers by the vegetables that their neighbor Will Dobbins traded for the guiding work Eli did on his behalf. The shelf of books had grown to fill 2 shelves, and then a third, because books accumulated around Eliza the way debris accumulated around a river bend, inevitably and in quantity. On a clear November evening, with James and Ruth asleep behind the curtain and the fire low and steady in the main room hearth, Eli and Eliza sat together at the table where she had been grading papers. She had put the papers aside and he had put aside the gear he had been mending, and they were simply sitting together in the quiet of a life that had accumulated into this evening, this firelight, this cabin, this world. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the first time you spoke?" "You are safe," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at the fire. "I have thought about those words many times. The first time because I needed to hear them and I believed them from you. And afterward because I kept finding out new ways they were true." He looked at her, at the dark hair that now had threads of silver in it, at the face he had learned like the mountains, every line and expression of it, and felt the same thing he had felt on that first cold night when she had looked up at him with terror in her eyes and he had watched it resolve into something else. The same thing, larger. "You are still safe," he said. "With me, always." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture she had made in the Aspens 8 years ago, skin on skin, her fingers through his. She held his hand in the firelight, and outside the November wind moved through the pines, and the mountains held them as they had always held them, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small and extraordinary human fact of 2 people who had found each other in the snow. "I know," she said. "I have always known." They stayed that way for a long time, in the warmth and quiet of the home they had built, while the stars came out above the bitter roots and the fire burned low, and the night settled in around them, full and complete and their own.